The grit of the Kandahar wind tasted like copper and ancient dust coating the back of Catherine's throat as she hauled the final crate onto the transport truck. It was 110 degrees in the shade, but the heat felt distant, numbed by the adrenaline of departure. She wiped a mixture of sweat and grime from her forehead with a sleeve that had long lost its original camouflage green. Her eyes darting to the inside of her locker one last time. Taped against the metal was a Polaroid curled at the edges by the dry air. It showed a man with laughing eyes, standing on a porch of rough-hewn pine, a fly rod in one hand, and a mug of black coffee in the other. The cabin on Hollow Creek. That image was the only thing that had kept her tethered to sanity through 3 tours of duty. "Hey, Cat, you coming or what?" a voice called out from the loading bay. Catherine turned her face, softening into that practiced, nurturing smile that made her the unofficial mother hen of the platoon. She reached into her rucksack and pulled out a battered tin wrapped in wax paper. "I made a final batch of oatmeal raisins," she said, tossing the tin to the young private who had called her. "Share them with the new rotation and tell them the secret ingredient is patience." The satellite phone on her belt vibrated a harsh mechanical buzz that cut through the engine noise of the idling Humvees. She frowned, checking the caller ID. It was domestic. Judith. Catherine stepped away from the noise, pressing the device to her ear, her heart rate spiking not from the mortar fire she was used to, but from the conditioned anxiety of hearing her mother's voice. "Mom, is everything okay?" she asked, her voice steady. There was no greeting, no question about whether Catherine was safe or even alive. Judith's voice was crisp, clear, and devoid of warmth, sounding more like a bank teller denying a loan than a mother speaking to her child. "I am calling to update you on a portfolio adjustment," Judith said. "I have finalized the sale of the cabin." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The desert silence suddenly roared in Catherine's ears. "What did you say?" Catherine whispered, her grip on the phone tightening until the plastic creaked. "I sold the cabin," Judith repeated, her tone irritated by the need for repetition. The market was volatile, and Randall found a fantastic opportunity in commercial real estate that required immediate liquidity. The structure was rotting anyway. It was a logical decision to divest. "That was Dad's house," Catherine said, the words choking her. "You know, I know you are sentimental," Judith cut in, her voice sharp, "but sentiment does not pay the property taxes. I am the parent here, Catherine. I made an executive decision for the family's financial health. I utilized the power of attorney you left to handle the closing. It is done." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. She had left a limited power of attorney for banking emergencies, not for liquidating the only piece of her father left on earth. But she did not scream. She did not cry. Years of military discipline and a lifetime of managing her mother's emotional deficits kicked in. "Thank you for the update," Mother Catherine said, her voice terrifyingly flat. "Good," Judith replied. "I knew you would understand the logic eventually." The line went dead. Catherine stood alone, in the swirling dust, staring at the phone. She did not smash it. Instead, she placed it carefully back into her pouch, her mind no longer on the flight home, but on the war she was about to start. 36 hours later, the dry heat of the Middle East was a hallucination replaced by the biting cold of a Montana winter. The transition was physically violent, a shock to the system that matched the ice forming in Catherine's chest. She drove her rental sedan down the familiar winding roads of her hometown, the tires crunching over packed snow. The town looked exactly the same, frozen in time. But as she turned onto the driveway of her childhood home, the change was glaring. Parked right in front of the Victorian-style main house, blocking the walkway, was a brand new cherry red sports car. It sat there like a fresh wound against the white snow, aggressive and out of place. Catherine killed the engine. She grabbed her duffel bag, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and walked up the steps. She did not knock. The house smelled of lemon pledge and stale lager. The living room was immaculate. Every magazine on the coffee table, aligned at perfect right angles, a testament to Judith's obsessive need for order. Judith stood by the window, wearing a stiff grey cardigan, watching the neighbours. She turned as the door closed, offering a single curt nod. "You made good time," Judith said. Catherine dropped her bag. "Hello, Mother." From the den, the sound of a football game blared. Randall, a man whose ambition had always outpaced his intelligence, was sprawled on the recliner. He lifted a beer bottle in a lazy salute, but did not stand up. "Welcome back, soldier," Randall called out, his eyes never leaving the television screen. Catherine ignored him, her gaze locking onto her mother. She needed to see the paperwork. She needed to see the lie in black and white. "Where is the money?" Catherine asked. Judith sighed, adjusting her glasses, as if dealing with a slow student. "As I told you, it has been reinvested. Randall's venture is a sure thing. The cabin was a liability, Catherine, just wood and nostalgia." Catherine walked past her mother toward the fireplace mantel. For 20 years, a framed photograph of her father holding her as a toddler had sat in the center, the heart of the room. Now it was gone. In its place stood a crystal award. Judith had won for community service. Catherine found the photo shoved behind a stack of coasters on a side table face down. The rage that surged through her was blinding, a white-hot flare that made her fingers twitch toward a weapon she wasn't carrying. She wanted to flip the coffee table. She wanted to scream until the window shattered. But she looked at Judith's face, a face that valued composure and hierarchy above all else. Losing control now would only validate Judith's narrative that Catherine was too emotional to handle adult decisions. Catherine picked up the photo of her father and wiped a speck of dust from the glass. She forced the corners of her mouth up. She accessed that part of herself that knew how to de-escalate, how to smile when a checkpoint guard pointed a rifle at her face. "I see," Catherine said softly. "You are right, Mother. I am just tired from the flight." Judith's shoulders relaxed, a smug victory settling in her eyes. "I knew you would be reasonable. Go get some rest. We can discuss your contribution to the household expenses tomorrow." "Of course," Catherine said. She walked up the stairs, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. She did not go to her bedroom to sleep. She went to her desk, took out a fresh notepad, and began to write down the name of every lawyer in town who had hated her mother, starting with her father's oldest friend. The house was sold, but the war had just begun. The next morning, Main Street was a tunnel of grey slush and exhaust, but the office of Arthur Harrison smelled of pipe tobacco and cedar, a scent that instantly transported Catherine back to her childhood. It was a sensory capsule of a time before sand and mortars, a time when her father would sit in one of the winged leather chairs, discussing fishing rights, while she coloured on the floor. Arthur looked older than the last photo she had seen. His hair was a shock of white, and his tweed jacket seemed a size too large for his shrinking frame. But his eyes behind the wire-rimmed glasses were sharp. He did not offer a handshake. He came around the heavy mahogany desk and pulled her into a hug that smelled of ink and peppermint. "I thought you were still in the desert," Arthur said, holding her at arm's length. "Your father would have been so proud of that stripes on your sleeve." "He would have been heartbroken." "Arthur," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mother sold the cabin." Arthur froze. The warmth vanished from his face, replaced by the granite hardness of a man who had practiced law for 40 years. He stepped back, moving behind his desk with a sudden sharp agility. "Sold," he repeated the word, tasting like vinegar. "That is impossible." "She told me it was done," Catherine said, sitting on the edge of the leather chair. "She said she used a power of attorney." "The money is already in Randall's account." Arthur began pulling thick bound files from a lower drawer. He slammed a folder onto the desk. Dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the window. "Your father did not trust Judith with the capital," Arthur said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "We established an irrevocable trust 3 years before he passed. Upon your 25th birthday, the title transferred solely to you. Judith was granted a life estate, meaning she could use the property until her death, provided she paid the taxes and maintained the structure." He spun the document around his finger, stabbing a paragraph in bold type. "And here is the exclusionary clause," Arthur continued. "The life estate is void immediately if the beneficiary cohabitates with a romantic partner who is not a spouse. By moving Randall in, she lost her right to even step foot on the porch, let alone sell it." "But she did sell it," Catherine said. "She found a buyer." "Then she committed a felony," Arthur said grimly. The only way a title company would clear that deed is if they were presented with a document overriding the trust. He reached into a separate file, his hands trembling slightly with rage, and pulled out a photocopy that had been faxed to his office just that morning by the county clerk. A routine notification he had not yet reviewed. He slid it across the desk. It was a special power of attorney, dated 2 months prior. At the bottom was Catherine's signature. Catherine stared at the ink. It was a good forgery. The loop of the K was slightly too wide. The crossing of the T, a fraction too aggressive, but to a stranger it looked authentic. She forged my signature while I was deployed. Catherine said, the realization settling in her gut like cold lead. She waited until I was 7,000 miles away. Arthur reached for the rotary phone on his desk. I am calling the sheriff. This is fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. We can have her in cuffs before lunch. Catherine reached out and placed her hand over his, stopping him. The contact was firm. No, she said. Arthur looked at her confused. Catherine, she stole your inheritance. If we arrest her now, she plays the victim, Catherine said, her eyes narrowing as she calculated the battlefield variables. She will cry to the town that she was confused, that she was just trying to manage family finances, and that her ungrateful daughter sent her to jail. Randall will slip away with whatever cash he has already siphoned. She stood up, walking to the window to look out at the snow-covered street. She saw the reflection of her own face in the glass. Not the daughter who baked cookies, but the soldier who planned ambushes. I do not just want the house back, Arthur. I want to burn their reputation to the ground. I want the town to see them for exactly what they are. Arthur slowly took his hand off the phone. He leaned back, studying her with a mixture of concern and respect. What do you need me to do? Prepare the eviction notice and the fraud lawsuit, Catherine said, turning back to him. Have the original trust documents ready, but do not file anything with the court until I give the signal. The lights at the Rusty Antler were dim, casting a golden haze over the noise of the Tuesday night crowd. It was the kind of establishment where the stakes were large, the wine was overpriced, and the local social hierarchy was strictly enforced. Tonight, Judith was holding court at the largest round table in the center of the room. Catherine moved through the restaurant in a navy blue cocktail dress that hugged her frame, a stark contrast to the fatigues she had worn for the last year. She carried herself with a fluid grace, smiling at old acquaintances, playing the role of the returning hero. At the table, Judith was beaming her hand, resting possessively on Randall's forearm. Randall was flushed, a half-empty glass of scotch in front of him, laughing too loudly at a joke made by the mayor's wife. There she is, Judith announced, as Catherine approached, her voice pitching up to ensure the neighbouring tables could hear. My brave girl. Back from the sandbox. Catherine leaned down and kissed her mother's cheek, the scent of expensive perfume failing to mask the underlying smell of desperation. I am just happy to be home, Catherine said, her voice dripping with honey. And so proud of you both. She took the empty seat next to Randall. He shifted uncomfortable, but Catherine immediately poured more wine into his glass, her movements servile and attentive. Mother tells me the investment is going to revolutionize the downtown district, Catherine said to him, widening her eyes with feigned admiration. It takes a lot of courage to leverage a family asset like that. Most men would be too afraid of the risk. Randall puffed out his chest, his ego swelling under the praise. Well, you know, Cat, fortune favors the bold. The cabin was just sitting there rotting. I told Judith we need to make that capital work for us. The buyers are wiring the final balance next week. We already have the deposit in cash. Cash, Catherine repeated, locking the detail away. That is wonderful. She turned to Judith, who was preening under the attention of the table. You know, Mother, Catherine said, pitching her voice so the nearby tables would fall silent to listen. It feels wrong to just hand over the keys in a lawyer's office. The cabin meant so much to Dad. And this sale, it is the start of your new life with Randall. It should be celebrated publicly. Judith tilted her head. What are you suggesting? A handover ceremony, Catherine said, gesturing with her wineglass. This Sunday, at the cabin. Invite the buyers, the neighbours, the mayor. Show everyone how you have successfully transitioned the estate. Show them that you are the matriarch who made the hard decision for the family's future. Judith's eyes lit up. The vanity was her weak point, a gaping hole in her defenses that Catherine drove a truck through. The idea of being publicly recognized as a shrewd businesswoman, of erasing the narrative of the grieving widow, was intoxicating to her. "That is actually a brilliant idea," Judith said, looking around the table for validation. A final farewell to the old and a welcome to the new. Randall nodded vigorously, calculating the free publicity for his non-existent development projects. The buyers would love that. They are city folk. They love that rustic charm nonsense. "Then it is settled," Catherine said, raising her glass. "To the cabin, and to the truth coming out." "To the future," Judith corrected, clinking her glass against Catherine's. Catherine smiled, sipping her wine. The liquid was bitter, but the anticipation of what was coming tasted sweet. The trap was set, and they had walked into it with their eyes wide open. Sunday morning at Hollow Creek was usually silent, save for the rushing water and the call of chickadees. But today, the air was thick with the smell of idling engines and expensive cologne. A dozen cars were jammed onto the gravel track leading to the cabin. A convoy of curiosity that Judith had summoned to witness her triumph. Catherine stood by the railing of the wraparound porch, her hand resting on the rough pine. The wood was cold, but beneath her palm, she could feel the ghost of the rasp her father had used to smooth it down 20 years ago. She remembered handing him the nails one by one, watching his breath plume in the winter air, as he told her that a house built with your own hands holds your soul in the grain. She squeezed the railing, grounding herself against the nausea of seeing strangers trampling through the yard, holding flutes of cheap champagne. Judith stood on the top step, elevated above the crowd, like a monarch addressing her subjects. She wore a cream-coloured wool coat that was impractical for the mud, but perfect for the photographs she hoped would appear in the local gazette. Beside her stood the buyers, a couple from Seattle, named the Sterlings, who looked at the cabin, not as a home, but as an architectural project to be gutted. "Attention, everyone," Judith called out, tapping a spoon against her glass. The chatter died down. "I want to thank you all for coming to say goodbye to this old place," Judith said, her voice trembling with a practiced melancholy. "It has been a heavy burden to carry since my husband passed. He was a man of great dreams, but very little practical sense, God rest his soul. He never understood that property is meant to be an asset, not an anchor." Catherine watched from the shadows of the eaves. Her face was a mask of polite interest, but her pulse was thumping a slow, heavy rhythm in her neck. Judith continued gesturing to Randall, who was leaning against a support beam, looking anxious but greedy. "Fortunately, with Randall's guidance and my decision to simplify our portfolio, we are passing this torch to the Sterlings. The proceeds will finally secure the family's future, something my late husband failed to do." A polite ripple of applause moved through the crowd. Mr. Sterling, a man in a sharp raincoat who checked his watch every 30 seconds, stepped forward. He placed a leather portfolio on the small table set up on the porch. Beside it lay a cashier's check, the amount face down, but the weight of it palpable. "Let us get this done," Judith said, beaming. She uncapped a fountain pen, the nib hovering over the deed of sale. Catherine stepped out of the shadows. Her boots made a heavy, deliberate sound on the floorboards that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Actually," Catherine said, her voice projecting with the clear, resonant authority of a drill sergeant, "I think we should clarify who exactly is saying goodbye today." Judith froze the pen inches from the paper. She looked up, her smile tightening into a grimace of warning. "Catherine, this is not the time for a scene. We discussed this." "I agree," Catherine said. She walked past her mother, ignoring her completely, and stopped in front of Mr. Sterling. She did not look like a grieving daughter anymore. She looked like a soldier securing a perimeter. "Mr. Sterling, before you hand over that check, I suggest you look at the title search again. Specifically, the section regarding the irrevocable trust established in 1998. Mr. Sterling frowned, looking from Catherine to Judith. The title company cleared this. "Your mother has power of attorney." Judith laughed, a brittle, high-pitched sound. "She is confused, Mr. Sterling. She has been under a lot of stress overseas." Just sign the papers. Catherine placed a manila envelope on top of the deed covering the signature line. The title company cleared it based on a special power of attorney document submitted 2 months ago. Catherine said calmly. She tapped the envelope. Inside this folder is a sworn affidavit from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, proving that on the date that document was allegedly signed by me in Montana, I was on a patrol in the Helmand province, 7,000 miles away. The silence that fell over the porch was absolute. The wind rushed through the pines louder than it had ever seemed before. Mr. Sterling opened the envelope. He pulled out the military records and a copy of the original trust deed. His eyes scanned the lines, his face turning a shade of red that matched the brick chimney. Judith stepped forward, her hand reaching out to snatch the papers. That is nonsense. I am her mother. I manage her affairs. This is a family misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling pulled the papers out of her reach. He looked at the signature on the military affidavit, then at the signature on the power of attorney document attached to the deed. The difference was subtle, but to a man about to spend $500,000, it was a canyon. You forged this, Sterling said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a sledgehammer. You do not own this property. You have a life estate that prohibits sale. Judith's composure shattered. The elegant matriarch dissolved, revealing the cornered animal beneath. She pointed a shaking finger at Catherine. You ungrateful brat! I did this for us. I have the right. I am the only reason this family has any standing in this town. Catherine did not flinch. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching her mother unravel. Actually, Catherine said, her voice slicing through Judith, shouting, you violated the terms of the life estate too. By cohabitating with Randall here, you triggered the forfeiture clause. She looked at the crowd, meeting the eyes of the neighbors, the shopkeepers, the people Judith had spent decades trying to impress. This party isn't for the cabin mother. It is a farewell party for you. Legally, you have been trespassing since the moment Randall moved his suitcase in. The crowd erupted into whispers. The humiliation was total. Judith looked around, searching for an ally, but faces turned away. She looked at Randall. Randall, tell them we had a verbal agreement. Randall, seeing the check being slid back into Mr. Sterling's jacket pocket, realized the ship was sinking. He backed away toward the steps, holding his hands up in surrender. I did not know anything about the paperwork, Judith. He stammered, his voice loud enough for the sheriff, who was parking his cruiser at the bottom of the hill, to hear. You told me you owned it free and clear. I am just a guest here. You coward. Judith shrieked, lunging at him, but he sidestepped her, stumbling down the stairs into the mud. Mr. Sterling turned to Judith, his face cold. My lawyer will be contacting you regarding the return of our deposit. If it is not in my account by tomorrow morning, I will be pressing charges for wire fraud. Come on, honey. The buyers marched off the porch, leaving Judith standing alone in the center of the stage she had built. The neighbors began to disperse, casting pitying and judgmental glances at the woman who had tried to sell a legacy she never earned. Catherine leaned against the railing, watching the cars begin to reverse down the drive. She did not feel happy. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the cold, hollow ache of a wound being cauterized, necessary but agonizing. The enemy was defeated, but the casualty was the mother she had always wished she had. The last of the sedans disappeared around the bend of the gravel road, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like atmospheric pressure dropping before a storm. The festive facade of the afternoon had evaporated, leaving the cabin stripped bare to its grey, weathered reality. On the porch, the air was still vibrating with the ghost of the humiliation Judith had just endured. Randall was halfway to his car, mumbling into his cell phone, his posture that of a rat, abandoning a sinking ship. Judith did not look at him. She stood rigid near the doorframe, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her chest heaving with sharp, shallow breaths. She turned slowly to face Catherine. There was no embarrassment in her eyes, only a raw, concentrated hatred that burned colder than the winter wind. Without a word, Judith crossed the distance between them. The movement was a blur fueled by decades of repressed control snapping all at once. Her hand connected with Catherine's cheek, a sharp cracking sound that echoed off the wooden eaves. The force of the blow knocked Catherine's head to the side. Her skin stung heat blooming rapidly across her jaw, but she did not raise a hand to defend herself. She did not flinch. She simply turned her head back, her eyes dry and terrifyingly calm, observing her mother as if she were a hostile combatant on the other side of a checkpoint. "You ungrateful, spiteful child!" Judith hissed, her voice shaking. "I raised you, I clothed you, I managed this family while your father played lumberjack in the woods, and this is how you repay me. You humiliate me in front of the entire county." Catherine tasted a hint of copper in her mouth. She looked at the woman standing before her, searching for any trace of the mother she had yearned for in the foxholes overseas. She saw nothing but a stranger obsessed with perception. "It was never about the money, Mother," Catherine said quietly. Judith scoffed, straightening her coat with trembling hands. "Don't be naive. It is always about the money. Randall had a plan. We could have been secure." No, Catherine continued, stepping closer, invading Judith's personal space for the first time in her life. "Even if Randall was a billionaire, you would have sold this place. You hate it here. You have always hated it." Judith's mouth opened to retort, but she stopped. A flicker of something honest passed over her face, a jagged edge of bitterness she had polished smooth for years. She looked at the rough logs of the cabin walls, her expression twisting into a sneer of genuine disgust. "Yes," Judith spat the word out. "I hated it. I hated the drafts. I hated the isolation, but mostly I hated how he looked when he was here. He loved this rotting pile of wood more than he ever loved a balanced ledger or a clean house or me. He would come here and forget his responsibilities. He would forget the order I tried so hard to build." She turned her cold gaze back to Catherine. "You are just like him," Judith said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than the scream. "Romanticizing potential while ignoring reality. Randall is a fool, perhaps, but at least he lives in the real world. You and your father, you live in a fantasy where sentiment pays the bills. Well, enjoy your pile of lumber, Catherine. It is all you have left." Judith turned on her heel and marched toward the driveway. She did not wait for Randall. She got into her own car, slammed the door, and reversed violently, spraying gravel as she sped away. Randall, realizing his ride and his meal ticket were leaving, scrambled into his sports car and peeled out after her, leaving a cloud of exhaust hanging in the twilight. Catherine stood alone on the porch. The silence returned, absolute and crushing. She waited until the engine sounds faded completely into the distance before she allowed her shoulders to drop. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her limbs heavy and her chest hollow. She reached up and touched her cheek. It was throbbing. She turned and walked into the cabin. The interior was freezing. The fire had died down hours ago, leaving only grey ash in the grate. The party guests had left muddy footprints on the hardwood floors, and a half-empty glass of champagne sat on the mantel, a vulgar reminder of the intrusion. Catherine locked the front door, the click of the deadbolt echoing loudly in the empty room. She sank onto the hearth of the stone fireplace, pulling her knees to her chest. She had won. The deed was safe. The fraud was exposed. The enemy had been routed. But as she looked around the darkening room, she felt no sense of victory, only a profound, aching isolation. Was it worth it? She asked the empty room. She had just severed the last tie to her living family. She had orphaned herself legally and emotionally. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was 38 years old, sitting in a cold house in the middle of nowhere, protecting a shrine to a dead man, while the living world moved on without her. The silence of the cabin felt less like peace and more like a tomb. She shivered, the cold seeping through her cocktail dress. Mechanically, she began to build a fire. She crumpled up the newspaper pages Judith had used to check stock prices and shoved them under the grate. She stacked kindling, her hands moving with the muscle memory her father had taught her. One match. The paper caught, curling into black flakes. The kindling snapped and popped, casting long dancing shadows against the walls. As the warmth began to radiate outward, Catherine stared into the orange heart of the flames. The smell of burning pine filled the room, a scent that bypassed her logical brain and went straight to her limbic system. Suddenly, she wasn't a soldier or a litigant. She was 10 years old, sitting on this same hearth wrapped in a wool blanket. She remembered her father sitting in the armchair behind her. He had been reading, but he had stopped to look at the fire. "This house is not wood and stone." Cat. His voice echoed in her memory, clear as a bell. "The world out there wants you to be something specific. It wants you to fit in a box. But this place, this is where you come to remember who you actually are when the noise stops." Catherine closed her eyes, tears finally leaking out hot and fast. She had thought she was fighting to punish her mother. She thought she was fighting for revenge. But sitting there, letting the heat thaw the ice in her bones, she realized the truth. Judith wanted to sell the house because it represented a version of life she couldn't control. Catherine had fought for it not because she hated Judith, but because without this place, without this anchor, she would have floated away into the abyss of her own trauma. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The grief was still there, heavy and sharp, but the doubt was gone. She was not guarding a tomb. She was holding the line for her own soul. Catherine stood up. She picked up the champagne glass from the mantel and walked to the kitchen sink, pouring the stale liquid down the drain. She rinsed the glass, dried it, and put it away in the cupboard. Then she picked up the broom. There was mud on the floor. There was work to be done. And for the first time since she stepped off the plane, Catherine felt like she was truly home. The sun had barely risen over the frost-covered lawns of the town when the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the curb of the Victorian house on Elm Street. It was not a social call. Behind the sheriff's vehicle sat Arthur Harrison's sedan, the engine idling a shark waiting in the water. Catherine stood on the sidewalk, watching the breath plume from her mouth in the cold air. She wore her dress uniform, every button polished, every crease sharp. It was psychological armor. She needed to be the soldier today, not the daughter. Arthur stepped out of his car carrying a thick briefcase. He nodded to the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Deputy Collins, who had known Catherine since high school. Collins looked uncomfortable, adjusting his belt, hating that he had to serve a warrant on a pillar of the community. But the paperwork Arthur had filed was bulletproof. They walked up the steps. Collins knocked a heavy, authoritative thud that rattled the stained glass of the front door. It took a long time for the door to open. When it did, Judith looked like a ghost of the woman who had held court at the restaurant days earlier. She was wearing a silk robe that had seen better days. Her hair unbrushed her face, devoid of the makeup she used as war paint. Her eyes darted to the sheriff, then to Arthur, and finally landed on Catherine. "What is this?" Judith whispered, her voice cracking. "Mrs. Sterling," Arthur said, his tone professional and dry. "We are here regarding the complaint filed this morning for forgery in the first degree, wire fraud, and grand larceny." Judith grabbed the doorframe. "You cannot be serious. I am her mother, and I am the plaintiff," Catherine said, stepping forward. "Where is Randall?" Judith blinked, looking back toward the empty hallway. He went to get bagels. He has been gone for 2 hours." Catherine walked past her mother into the house. She went straight to the guest room where Randall had been staying. The closet door was open. The hangers were bare. The drawers of the dresser were pulled out empty. On the nightstand, the expensive watch Judith had bought him for Christmas was gone, along with the cash box. Judith kept in her study. "He is not coming back," Mother Catherine said, returning to the foyer. "He took what he could carry and ran the moment the check bounced or the moment he smelled the law. I bet if you check your jewelry box, the pearls are gone too." Judith slumped against the wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She looked small, frail. Stripped of the delusions that had propped her up, she began to weep. Not the elegant, silent tears she performed at funerals, but ugly, heaving sobs of a woman who realized she was entirely alone. "Please, Catherine," Judith gasped between sobs. "You cannot send me to jail. I am 60 years old. I will die in there. I just wanted to fix things. I just wanted us to be secure. Catherine looked down at her. A part of her, the part that had been trained to nurture, wanted to kneel and comfort her. But she remembered the for sale sign. She remembered the signature forged while she was dodging bullets. There is a way out, Catherine said. Arthur stepped forward, opening his briefcase on the hall table. He pulled out a single document. This is a quitclaim deed, Arthur explained. It voluntarily terminates your life estate interest in the cabin property, effective immediately. It grants Catherine full unencumbered fee. Simple ownership. Catherine knelt, forcing Judith to look her in the eye. You return every cent of the deposit to the Sterlings today, Catherine said, her voice hard as iron. You liquidate your stocks, you sell this house if you have to, but you pay them back so they do not press charges. And then you sign this paper. You give up the cabin. Forever. You never set foot on that land again. Judith looked at the paper, then at Catherine. To lose the cabin was to lose her last leverage, her last claim to the matriarchy she desperately pretended to hold. And if I do? Judith asked weakly. Then I drop the forgery complaint, Catherine said. You stay out of prison. You keep your freedom, but you lose me. Judith's hand trembled as she took the pen Arthur offered. She hesitated, looking at the empty space where Randall's coat used to hang, realizing that her practical, logical world had collapsed. She had traded loyalty for money, and now she had neither. She signed. The scratch of the pen against the paper was the loudest sound in the house. Arthur took the document, checked the signature, and notarized it on the spot with his stamp. He handed the copy to Catherine. It is done, Arthur said softly. Catherine stood up. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back. She walked out of the house, down the steps, and into the morning sun. The air tasted clean. 2 weeks later, the scent of pine needles was overpowered by the smell of fresh linseed oil and white paint. The cabin on Hollow Creek looked different. The overgrown brush that had choked the front porch was gone, cleared away by blistered hands and sweat. The rotting railing had been replaced with new cedar smelling sharp, mint and earthy. Catherine stood on a ladder, applying a final coat of sealant to the eaves. She wore her old fatigues stained with paint and sawdust, her hair tied back in a messy bun. Her muscles ached with a satisfying, honest fatigue that she hadn't felt in years. She climbed down and wiped her hands on a rag. Stepping back, she admired the work. The cabin no longer looked like a forgotten relic. It looked alive. It looked cared for. She walked inside. The interior was sparse but warm. The heavy velvet curtains Judith had installed were gone, replaced by simple linen that let the light flood in. The floorboards gleamed. Catherine walked to a cardboard box sitting on the floor. She reached in and pulled out the framed photograph of her father. She had spent an hour fixing the backing that had been bent when it was shoved aside. She carried it to the mantel. She placed it right in the center, where it belonged. "Hello, Dad," she whispered. The sound of tires on gravel drew her attention. She looked out the window to see Arthur's sedan pulling up. He moved slower these days, using a cane to navigate the uneven ground, but his smile when he saw the house was bright enough to light the room. Catherine met him at the door, 2 steaming mugs of black coffee already in her hands. "You did not have to drive all the way out here." "Arthur," she said, handing him a mug. "I wanted to see it," Arthur said, taking a sip and sighing with contentment. "And I brought the final deed. Recorded and filed. It is yours, Catherine. Free and clear. No strings, no ghosts." Catherine looked out at the creek, watching the water rush over the stones, constant and changing all at once. "Thank you, Arthur, for everything." Arthur looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "So what now? Do you stay? Do you sell it yourself and travel?" Catherine shook her head. "I am staying. I have some friends from the unit who are looking for a place to decompress after their tours. I was thinking of opening it up, a place for people who need to find their footing again." Arthur smiled, a genuine, proud expression that warmed Catherine more than the coffee. "Your father would have liked that. He always said this place was a sanctuary. Catherine looked back at the photo on the mantel. She thought about Judith alone in her perfect house with her empty victories. She thought about the blood that connected them and how thin that connection really was compared to the bond she had with the man standing beside her or the soldiers she had served with. Family is not the DNA you share, Catherine said, her voice steady and sure. Family are the people who stand guard over the things you love when you cannot be there to protect them yourself. She clinked her mug against Arthur's. To the cabin, she said. Arthur nodded. To the cabin. They stood together on the porch, drinking their coffee in the crisp mountain air, watching the sun climb higher over the tree line, illuminating a home that was finally truly hers. Here is the reflective conclusion and educational message based on the story written in American English using the second-person point of view to directly engage the reader. You have just watched the dust settle on Catherine's war. There is a profound sense of satisfaction in seeing the bad guy lose, especially when that antagonist is a family member who weaponized guilt for financial gain. But before you close this chapter, take a moment to look beyond the drama of the courtroom and the confrontation on the porch. The story of The Cabin on Hollow Creek isn't just a thriller about revenge, it is a cautionary tale about preparation boundaries and the cold reality of protecting your legacy. First, let's talk about the legal armor that actually saved Catherine. It wasn't her anger, and it wasn't her military training. It was her father's foresight. You might think estate planning is boring, something reserved for the wealthy or the elderly. But this story proves it is an act of love. Catherine's father didn't just leave a will, which can be easily contested or lost. He created an irrevocable trust. Do you know the difference? In the eyes of the law, a will is a letter to a judge telling them what you want to happen. A trust is a legal entity that actually owns the property. By placing the cabin in a trust, her father ensured that no matter how much Judith screamed, manipulated, or rationalized, she legally did not own the asset she was trying to sell. The lesson here is concrete. Verbal promises mean nothing when money is on the table. If you want to protect your family from future conflict, you have to put it in ink. Have you checked your own family's documents lately? Do you know who actually holds the title to the places you call home? Second, consider the weapon Judith used, the power of attorney. This is one of the most powerful and dangerous documents in the American legal system. Catherine gave her mother power because she felt she had to. It's what dutiful daughters do. Right, wrong. You should never grant financial power to someone based on blood relation alone. You grant it based on character and competence. If there is someone in your life who has a history of overstepping boundaries or managing money poorly, handing them a power of attorney is like handing them a loaded gun. Who holds your proxy? If you were unable to speak for yourself tomorrow, are you 100% certain that person would follow your wishes? Or would they follow their own interests? Finally, there is the hardest lesson of all. The definition of family. Throughout the story, you likely felt the tension between what Catherine owed her mother versus what she owed herself. We are often taught that family is a supreme institution that demands unconditional loyalty. But Judith proves that toxic people do not magically become healthy just because they share your DNA. Catherine's victory wasn't just getting the house back. It was the moment she realized she could walk away. She set a boundary. She realized that keeping the peace was actually just a fancy way of saying, letting myself be abused. You have the right to protect your mental health and your financial future, even if it means saying no to a parent. So as you step away from Hollow Creek, ask yourself, is there a Judith in your life? Someone who views your boundaries as an insult? Are you holding on to a sentimental asset that needs legal protection before it's too late? If you disappeared tomorrow, would your legacy be safe, or would it be sold to the highest bidder? Catherine found her peace not by hoping for the best, but by preparing for the worst. She built her sanctuary on a foundation of truth and legal solidity. Make sure you are doing the same, because at the end of the day, the only things that truly belong to you are the things you have the courage and the paperwork to defend.